On December 19th, 2025, Chinese state television aired footage that most people ignored. But inside the Pentagon, it triggered alarm bells. Because hidden inside what looked like routine military drills was something far more unsettling. China was rehearsing an invasion, not of Taiwan, not of the South China Sea, but of the United States itself. What you're about to hear isn't speculation, it isn't conspiracy, and it certainly isn't science fiction. It's the story of how China quietly built a strategic presence in America's backyard, using ports instead of bases, loans instead of bombs, and trade instead of troops. And how, without firing a single shot, Beijing may have already rewritten the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. On that December day, deep inside China's interior, at the Chuchqing military training base in Henan province, state broadcaster CCTV released footage meant for global consumption. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. Tanks rolled across dusty terrain. Soldiers stormed beaches. Amphibious units moved with discipline and precision. But to trained military analysts, something felt wrong. These were not generic drills. The Red Force, representing the People's Liberation Army, was conducting a coordinated war simulation against a Blue Force, the unmistakable stand-in for the United States military. The most disturbing element wasn't the weapons on display. It was the map. The theater of operations wasn't Taiwan. It wasn't the South China Sea. It was the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea, and the southern coastline of the United States. For the first time in modern history, a rival superpower publicly practiced a war on America's doorstep. The scenario assumed something even more alarming. Chinese forces had already secured logistical footholds across the Caribbean basin and near Cuba. From there, reaching Florida or Texas wouldn't take days. It would take hours. This broadcast wasn't subtle. It was a strategic message delivered directly to Washington. Push us in the Pacific, and we can push you in the Atlantic. The era of fighting wars safely overseas is over. This moment forces a brutal reassessment of the Western Hemisphere. For more than a century, the Caribbean and Latin America served as America's strategic buffer, a protected zone that allowed the United States to project power globally without worrying about invasion at home. That security depended on one core assumption. No rival great power had a foothold there. That assumption is now dead. The simulation at Chuchqing wasn't fantasy. It reflected a new reality. When U.S. naval forces redeployed from the Atlantic to counter threats in Asia, they must pass through the Caribbean and the Panama Canal. China doesn't need to defeat the U.S. Navy in the Pacific if it can trap it in the Caribbean. And Beijing's most effective weapon isn't a fleet of warships, it's infrastructure. While headlines fixate on spy balloons and diplomatic scandals, China has spent the past 2 decades executing a quiet, methodical campaign to draw Latin America into its economic orbit. Once economic dependence is complete, military access becomes inevitable. Historically, Latin America, from the Rio Grande to Tierra del Fuego, was firmly under U.S. influence. Washington shaped the region's politics, trade, and security alliances. China chose a different approach. It used money instead of force. Today, China is South America's largest trading partner, officially overtaking the United States. When Mexico and Central America are included, the gap is closing so fast that reversing it would require a global economic shock. Chinese state-owned companies now dominate investments in energy grids, telecommunications, space infrastructure, and most critically, ports. This isn't an empire of territory. It's an empire of logistics. A major study identified 37 ports across Latin America and the Caribbean that are owned, operated, or heavily financed by Chinese entities. On a map, they don't resemble trade routes, they resemble a tightening noose. High-risk ports include Kingston in Jamaica and Manzanillo and Veracruz in Mexico, all positioned near the most vulnerable maritime choke points in the Western Hemisphere. Kingston alone sits astride sea lanes used by nearly every U.S. naval vessel transiting between oceans. Whoever controls that port controls docking priority, harbor pilots, logistics flows, and most importantly, data. Modern ports are digital fortresses. Their cranes, tracking systems, and communications networks are often powered by Chinese platforms like Huawei and Logink. This gives Beijing informational dominance, visibility into American supply chains, troop movements, and logistical timelines. In wartime, that intelligence is priceless. Here is where the brilliance of China's model becomes clear. The United States builds military bases. China builds commercial ports. If a pier can handle a 200,000-ton container ship, it can handle an aircraft carrier. No treaties, no flags, just contracts. The Chinese Navy can refuel, resupply, and repair under civilian agreements, creating a shadow network of logistical hubs across America's backyard without the diplomatic cost of formal alliances. The threat escalates even further when commercial shipping itself becomes a weapon. China dominates global shipbuilding and container production. Military analysts have confirmed the development of containerized missile systems, cruise missiles hidden inside standard shipping containers. Any civilian freighter can become a launch platform. Now combine that capability with control over dozens of ports across Latin America. Suddenly, thousands of commercial vessels operating near U.S. waters could theoretically serve as launch platforms. This isn't science fiction. It's how modern warfare is designed. This level of infiltration didn't happen overnight. China's relationship with Latin America stretches back centuries, from the Manila galleon trade to Chinese laborers building railroads and plantations across the Caribbean. Cultural ties existed long before geopolitical ones. The political pivot began in 1972, after President Nixon's visit to Beijing, when Latin American nations gradually shifted diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China. But the real acceleration came in 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization. In 2000, China absorbed less than 2% of Latin America's exports. Today, trade exceeds $518 billion and continues to grow at extraordinary speed. China pulls raw materials out of the continent and floods markets with affordable, increasingly sophisticated manufactured goods, cars, machinery, electronics. Western competitors simply can't match the prices. Economic dependence follows. Political compliance soon after. Nowhere is this more evident than in the lithium triangle of Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, which holds roughly half of the world's known lithium reserves. Lithium is the oil of the 21st century. While the West debated climate policy, China bought the mines. Today, even American electric vehicles rely on supply chains that trace back to Chinese-controlled lithium operations in the Andes. Perhaps the most overlooked frontier of all is space. China operates deep space tracking facilities in South America, most notably in Argentina, under long-term agreements with minimal local oversight. Officially, these facilities are civilian. Strategically, they are military. They can track satellites, intercept communications, and monitor U.S. orbital activity. an electronic eye embedded in America's blind spot. So, where is the United States in all of this? Washington sees what's happening. The problem isn't ignorance, it's paralysis. American responses have swung between symbolic initiatives, warnings without alternatives, and creeping threats of force. The United States offers seminars and frameworks. China offers bridges, railways, and cash. When economic tools fail, pressure builds to return to hard power, especially around the Panama Canal in Venezuela. That path risks catastrophic miscalculation, because while the U.S. remains militarily dominant, its industrial base has been hollowed out. China is the factory of the world. In a prolonged conflict, production capacity matters more than individual technological superiority. China has built an empire of trade that now encircles an empire of force. The United States faces a choice: accept a multipolar Western Hemisphere, or escalate toward a confrontation that could fracture the global order. This isn't the future, it's happening now. The lithium in your phone, the soy in your food, and the chips in your car all flow through supply chains increasingly painted red. The war games in Chongqing were just the trailer. Empires rarely fall because they are invaded. They fall because they become too expensive and too slow to adapt. The United States is betting on military supremacy. China is betting on trade, infrastructure, and time. Which bet would you take? This has been Eon Empires. If you want to understand how power really works, subscribe. We don't just follow the news, we follow the money. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Is the United States already too late in Latin America, or can it still turn the tide? I'll be reading every response.